This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel, and the Israel Institute, enhancing the knowledge and study of modern Israel. If you like us, please join our community of supporters by giving to our Patreon campaign. You'll find it on our homepage, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll to the bottom, and you'll see a big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. We're counting on you. I'm Dalia Shenlin.
And I'm Gilad Halpern. Every week we'll be talking about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. This week we'll welcome Hanna Yablonka. She's a historian and professor of Israel and Jewish studies at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. She's a prolific scholar of early Israeli history, most notably culture, society, and politics in the shadow of the Holocaust. And her latest book, entitled Children by the Book, Biography of a Generation, the First Native Israelis Born Between 1948 and 1955, that was recently published in Hebrew by Yediot Ahronot Books, is the latest addition to her extensive body of work. Professor Hanna Yablonka, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
So how does one even attempt to write a biography of a whole generation?
One can attempt anything. But it was a dream of mine. I thought there is a huge story behind an amorphic generation. I did not, at that time, define it very well. And I had it in my mind as a dream to once I will be a full professor, to write this book, which I really wanted to write differently, without footnotes, nevertheless, as a very serious research. And so I did, actually. Once I was a full professor, it took me a couple of years, and then I dedicated like 9 years to writing this book. And actually, the notion, the feeling that I had, my gut feeling, that it is really a generation, of course, a generation in the sociological meaning, and not the biological meaning, came out as a real notion, and it is really a generation, and I can judge it today. It's about 5 months since the book came out, by the reaction of those 300,000 children that were born in Israel between 1948 and 1955. The reception of the book was so enthusiastic. Actually, usually research books don't turn into bestsellers. This turned out into a huge bestseller. And I'm invited, every week I have about 3 meetings with audiences around the book, and it's going, and it's exceeding my wildest expectations.
What do you mean when you say it's a sociological generation? It's not just that they were physically born during those years. There's something that characterizes them. What is it about this generation that you say makes them a generation?
Okay, biological generation is not 7 years, naturally. This is a sociological generation. That means it's a generation by the formative events of their lives, which in a way shape them, shape their Israelism, shape their connections with the newly born state of Israel, and actually formed much of their worldview around the existence of Israel, which is actually a very, let's say, loaded issue.
The interesting thing about it is that the formative events of that generation came before they were born, which is the Holocaust and the establishment of the State of Israel. In a way, they grew up in the shadow of these two events that preceded their existence. I mean, isn't that, contradictory to what you just said?
The answer is yes and no. Yes, because this was the formative events of their parents. Most 300,000 children that were the first native Israeli born, their parents were either survivors of the Holocaust, or some of them, which were the elite, the aristocrats, the legendary generation, were born to those who were in Israel for the second and third and fourth generation. And the last were those who fought in the War of Independence. By the way, many survivors of the Holocaust also fought in the War of Independence, but most survivors of the Holocaust came after the state was born.
Although we should also clarify that when you talk about this generation that you just described, we're not including Palestinian citizens, Arabs who were already born here during that, who were born here during that time,
Yes.
and ultra-Orthodox, right?
No.
You are including ultra-Orthodox.
Including every Jew who was born in Israel during the years 1948, 1955. I did not include the Arab citizens who were the same because I cannot read Arabic and you cannot make a serious research without reading in the language of origin. So these formative events which you described were the formative events of our parents. But of course, they overshadowed our later path of life. Now, let me explain. Actually, we were born into the state as a regular, mundane fact. We were not overwhelmed by it because we were born into it. So we were the first Jewish generation to born to a state as a everyday fact of life, which is something unheard in history, in Jewish history, in the last 2,000 years. But we shared with our parents the big happiness. I use this word also in Hebrew. The big happiness of the existence of our small state. I have to add to that. Our parents viewed us as a remedy, as an experience of remedy, because all their hopes were focused on us as the first generation who doesn't know what the experience of being a minority is, that we're the first generation who doesn't know what anti-Semitism is, and actually we represent the beginning of a new era. In our born here, in our birth here in Israel, the sovereign Jewish state, within the majority group of the population, we represent from our parents a new era. We didn't know that it's a new era, but we felt the great expectations from us. On the other hand, because we knew the history of our parents and where they came from, we understood that the gift of the state to which we were born should not be taken easily. We owe something. And since we owe something, we have to be very, in a way, I'll say it in English, conform to what was expected from us. So we were actually a very pleaser generation. We tried to please our eldest all the time by being good children, by being good soldiers, by being good students, by never hurting our parents.
Why do you think it's important to focus on Israeli-born people of that generation? Because there were many, many others. I mean, it was a time of great migration from virtually everywhere, and many people of your generation, your biological generation, were just happened to be born elsewhere and came here as infants or as very small children and were socialized into that reality that you're describing now. What is really the analytical difference between the Israeli-born ones and the migrants who came here as very young children?
There isn't, and I write it in my introduction, that somebody who was born in December of 1945 actually grew in the same circumstances as those who were born. But once you have a serious research, you have to define very clearly who you are talking about. And it's very symbolic to speak about those who were born in, native-born Israelis. And this group was the first. Those who were born in Germany, in a DP camp, and came when they were 2 months old. They were not born here. And that's the difference. But actually, they had the same biography.
But do you think there's any difference in something maybe subtle or imperceptible about who they are, about how they feel, experience the world just because, knowing that you were born in a DP camp or knowing that you were born an Israeli in the Free State of Israel, the Jewish people? Do you think this has any lasting impact on people in life? I mean, you've studied both of these groups now, correct?
Yes. I don't think so. I don't think so, except that my children could say that they were second-generation Israelis.
So the difference is in the next generation.
Yes, the difference is in the next generation. But all of us, all of those who were born in those years, by the way, generally speaking, in the world, part of the world baby boomers, but yet quite different.
You're preempting my next question.
Lots of questions about that.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Have the same biography and the same formative events which shaped their worldview. and stems from one of the book's main issues, which is the issue of borders.
Yeah, actually, can we ask about those borders since you mentioned them? I mean, and this goes to Gilad's question. You mentioned that two of the major borders of the family life were the gender roles and the generational borders. And I thought to myself, well, when I look back on my parents' generation, who were around the same generation you're talking about, why is that different? They also had gender roles in the U.S. and in other Western countries, very clearly defined. And there was also a different understanding of generational respect. Young people were not yet in the rebellious era of the 1960s. What was different, if anything, about the Israeli nature of those borders?
Because the first difference is, of course, the most crucial one. The fact that we were born to a state with borders, defined borders. This is something I have to emphasize very clearly. The only picture I put in the book was a picture we got on Israel's 10th anniversary. And we got a small booklet, which is called, it's in Hebrew, Alei Asor, Upon a Decade. Yes. And this booklet contained actually the Israeli map, giving the length between one border and the other. We grew up with the small Israel. We also called it Artzenu HaKtantonet, our small country. That was the name. And our national identity was shaped in small Israeli. We knew exactly to shape it. We knew to paint it. We knew exactly what is the western border, the eastern border, the northern border, the southern border. And we never aspired for anything. The term which we say chutz la'aretz, which is literally, if I translate it, out of the country, is unlike any other nation in the world, because it really meant this was our whole world, Israel, the small Israel. And everything else was outside the country. And since we could not get outside the country, even not on land, because Israel had enemies on its borders, this was our whole world. Only very few Israelis had passports in the 1950s and the 1960s. None of us went abroad. What we call chutz la'aretz, you call abroad. Nothing of this existed. So all our lives and all our identity was shaped within the Israeli borders. And so we were actually Israelis, exclamation mark. We had a very defined country. We had a very deep knowledge of the Israeli language, the Hebrew. We were about the last generation to speak.
It's all been downhill since.
Yes, exactly. To speak Hebrew and know its archaeological layers, because we learned by heart pieces of the Bible. And we actually grew up with the scenery of Israel. We went to see Israel by foot. And we grew up with the flowers of Israel, with the lakes of Israel. So Israel was our whole national entity. Besides that, were other borders. Some of them universalistic. The gender border, there was a defined role in the family for the mother, a defined role in the family for the father, except in Israel, it also added the military, which was mostly the privilege of men.
Even though at the time Israel was famous for having the universal draft, including for women, and people, I think, around the world sort of looked up to Israel as a sort of egalitarian
Yes,
army.
except in the roles in the army. The women were never pilots. That's a modern development. They were never fighters. I'm not including the War of Independence, of course, because the War of Independence, there were some fighters, very few that were women, but basically in the army, the gender continued.
But I wanted to ask you, in relation to that, to the fixed existence of borders, perhaps this rootedness that you're talking about, even provincialism, if I may, is that what really sets your generation, the generation you study here, apart from other baby boomers around the world? Because unlike baby boomers, they couldn't, the sky was never the limit.
Basically, the baby boomers all over the world are considered to be the luckiest generation ever. Today, it's also accompanied with a blame that we ate all the resources, so we didn't leave anything for our children, which I guess has some truth to it. In Israel, it was very different because, first of all, in Israel is a very demanding state, and it was demanding also vis-a-vis us. Basically, of course, we had a very, very happy childhood in Israel. I had a very happy childhood. Inside the houses, there was, unlike other baby boomers in the world, especially in America, there was a lot of grief because 55% of this generation are children of Holocaust survivors. So inside the families, inside the homes, there was a deep grief because most of our parents lost all their families in the Shoah. And inside the house, there was also deep grief to the consequences of the War of Independence, in which 1% of the population died. So basically, inside the houses, there was a big struggle to make ends meet and to overcome the big grief of the big events that have preceded our birth. But outside, we had a very happy childhood. We had great expectations that were aimed towards us. And we are actually, in a way, very different from the other baby boomers because later on, in our adolescence, we did not revolt. We never had the chance to revolt because the government, our parents, gave us this state. And suddenly when we came to the teenage, the horrible teenage, there was a 6-day war. And we, again, faced the fact that our eldest are so smart and so successful. We didn't have anybody to revolt against. So our generation never revolted. And then actually, after our teenage, we went to the army and we faced two of Israel's biggest war, the Hattasha and
the War of Attrition.
And the War of 1973, in which our generation played the pivot role, and this was actually the first breakdown.
And what was that breakdown like?
Immediately after the 6-day war, we were the first generation to pay the price of this big celebration. Because immediately after the 6-day war, first of all, our military service was prolonged, temporarily, so to say, but permanently. And immediately after that came this war of attrition, yes, which was Israel's longest war. It started a few days after the 6-day war and it ended, so-called, in August of 1970. All this military at that time were our generation, between 1968 and 1970. 1,000 soldiers died in that war. Every day, actually, if you looked at the paper, you saw a black frame with young names in the paper. This was, by the way, the first crack in our soft childhood, in our belief that everything is really, really so perfect. But then came the 73 war. Now, the 73 war, in which also our generation played a pivotal role, let me say something in brackets. I consider the 6-day war, the attrition war, and the 1973 war as one war. It's actually one continuum of war. I can tell you how I told the 1973 war. I was very lucky. At the IDF archive, there is one unit which is called Tzadach, which is the censorship of letters of soldiers. And I didn't want to tell about battles. I wanted to see this war through the eyes of the generation. And every letter that was sent from every soldier was copied, and then the original was either cut out, what they didn't want to publish, or marked with black
redacted
marker. But I got to see the full letters, and I put them by the date. I arrayed them chronologically. And then you can see what happens in 1973. The first few days, although very bloody and very shocking, the letters tell the story of, it's a second 6-day war. Tomorrow or the day after that we'll be in Cairo. And then slowly you see how reality penetrates awareness. And by the end of the second week, you see soldiers cursing war and cursing the commanders and cursing the IDF leaders, but really with harsh words. And our generation, which never wanted to hurt their parents, who wanted to be very appeasing with their parents, very pleasing with their parents, suddenly start to complain, suddenly start to express the shock. Now, after the 1973 war, there were two big movements that arose out of this war. By the way, in 1973, 2,700 soldiers died, 9,000 were injured, and about 400 were missing. This was really a national grief and shock. But after the war, two movements arose. One of them is Gush Emunim, which is those who built in the settlements, the settlement movement. And they arose out of the feeling that in order to get out of the depression, which was very vast, the rebuilding of the old Israel, Eretz Israel, is the right answer.
Even though they had already started with various forms of settlement right after 67.
Really
it was a movement per se.
A movement as a therapeutic movement. All the establishers of that movement were born in the 1930s or beginning of the 1940s. 4 years later, and there was also Moti Ashkenazi, but Moti Ashkenazi actually asked only for one thing, although he's not the generation, he's older than this generation. He asked only for the resignation of Golda and Moshe Dayan.
That was a protest movement that was set up after the war.
Yes, but it was a political movement.
Led by this gentleman, Moti Ashkenazi.
Yes, Moti Ashkenazi. In 1977, Sadat came to Israel and broke a psychological barrier. And the peace talks started with Begin and Dayan and Sadat. By the second year, there was a feeling that Begin is actually schmoozing the negotiations.
Like dragging them out.
Yes. And 364 officers from the army, all of them from this generation, published a letter, which is called the Officers' Letter, claiming that they will not be able to go to the next war without being sure that Israel did everything in its ability and turn every stone in order to try and achieve peace and assimilation in the area in which we live in. This is, of course, no surprise, because this is the generation that is imprinted with the Israeli borders, and actually what they wish is a normalization of life. We are a state like any other state, and we should be a part of the area in which we live in. Now, this letter was, of course, received with a big shock in the government. One of the ministers even called it a putsch. Some of those who signed it were those who got the highest decorations for the war in 1973, Yuval Neria and others. It was signed only by men. Yuli Tamir, who later became a minister of education, was also an officer, and she was in Sinai during the war.
And a future guest on the Tel Aviv Review.
Oh, okay. And she asked to sign this letter, and they actually avoided her from signing the letter. It was a man, a very manly...
Because it had to be serious, so it had to be
serious, yes, and effective. And then they received a huge response from the universities and from the public. Now, at the universities at that time were people from this generation. And when they came to the universities to speak with students, the halls were packed with people, and they decided to make one demonstration or protest in Tel Aviv, in what is called today the Rabbit Square. And on that square, on the night, somebody put a small piece of paper on the stage. We want peace now. And all the rest is history.
I sense the name of a movement.
Peace Now is actually the movement of our generation. And if you read the letter, you can see the cry of our generation to go back to the quiet, hopeful...
Okay, so let me ask you this. Where is this generation today? I mean, you were so powerful 40 years ago and more. You're still around. I mean, many of you are. I'm sorry to say that. You're not that old. But, you're still active, living and active citizens in Israel. How do you explain the decline this sharp decline in your power. Your agenda is really almost nowhere to be seen.
At this point, I'm moving to my own view because I didn't research it. This book needs to have a second part. What happened, the book ends in 1981 after Tnuat Yesh Gvul. There is a border, again, borders.
Which we should say is also a peace movement.
Yes, and it was also a creation of my generation, of this generation.
And they would probably be considered traitors today because they call for refusal to serve in the occupied territory.
But still, it's my people's movement. So I can state only what I think at this point. It's not a research. It calls for a second part, this book, which I will not write.
You leave it to a younger scholar.
Yes. When I asked my son, my oldest son, how should I call my book? And not Children by the Book, he said, call it Generation 1.0. I said, my generation will not understand this name. So, this is a very crucial question. Let me tell you first a very sad fact. For this book, I interviewed 30 of the 42 children who were born on the day Israel was declared. That means May 15th, 1948. 1/3 of them, their children don't live in Israel. There is 1,200,000 Israelis with foreign passports, European passports.
Out of a population of 8.75 million.
Yes. But out of the population of 6 million Jews, only 6 million
But we don't know
Jews.
which portion of that 1 million something are Jews who live outside the country.
All of them, European passports, only Jews get. Because they lived in those countries before. That's one of the
descendants of European
descendants,
immigrants.
yes. Right. Because that's one of the claims of the Arabs. You can go to your previous countries.
Okay,
right?
so you're talking about people with European passports?
Israelis.
Yes.
Not just foreign passports.
No. Most of them have European passports. This is, in a way, a very powerful declaration of the fact that we lost our basic confidence in the future of the country. I have to say it this way. I'm sorry. The big dream is, of course, America. Our appreciation is to the American speakers. We have one good example for that. And, of course, America and whatever it represents. You don't call it Yerida anymore, which is the Jewish term.
Pejorative term, we should say,
yes,
going down.
The judgmental term of leaving the country, of immigration. But we call it today relocation or whatever. And 1/3, that means 10 of the Israeli that were born on the day of the declaration of the state, all their children don't live in the country. Yeah. This is an immigration, I think, unprecedented in the world as a whole. The escape of minds, which we call in Israel, is the biggest.
Brain drain. Yeah.
The brain drain is the biggest in the OECD.
So let me ask you a question, because this relates to something that you said quite in the beginning of the book that I think was interesting, and I think it relates to what you're talking about, which is that you say it's much more acceptable or fashionable even in Israeli historiography to look back with a certain kind of anger. It's hard to translate, but you say in Hebrew, sikumim nokvim v'matrisim, like you look back with a critical perspective, but you, in this book, look back with affection and nostalgia. So related to what you're talking about, maybe people are looking back on the past because they feel so disillusioned in the present. Why do you think there is this angry look back? And was your book kind of a corrective to say we can also love? But on the other hand, if we romanticize what was in the past, maybe we're even more disappointed now.
Okay, first of all, unlike some of my friends in the academia, I have to say it's not a nostalgic book whatsoever.
I thought it was nostalgic.
Yeah, I thought so too.
No, it wasn't. Okay. It starts with our very soft childhood and very confident childhood, that our country is only moving upwards and upwards, and there is nothing that is too small for it, which was the case. The feeling was, if I have to cite Obama, the feeling of Israel of the 1950s and the 1960s was, yes, we can. the feeling and the discourse of Israel 2019 is we can't do anything. We cannot repair the transportation. We have no partner to speak about peace. Nothing, everything is beyond our possibilities. This is Israel of 1990.
You just reminded me that every time, for years after I moved here, I would go to a cafe and I would order a salad and I would say, do you mind adding, nuts or something to my salad? And they would say, it's impossible.
Yeah.
What is
and
impossible?
I would say, but as an American, I would say, where does that come from? I hear this is impossible all the time.
This is
in the early,
this is
late
the
90s.
crucial, if I may say so, this is the crucial change in Israel in which I was born and Israel of today. It's not nostalgia, it's an observation. That's why I loved Yes We Can of Obama. And that is basically the essence of Zionism. Im tirtzu en zogada. If you want, it will not be a legend. This is the essence of Zionism. We don't believe in ourselves anymore whatsoever. This is the first thing. Now, nostalgia has two faces. The one, of course, which is criticized, is the fact that it's an escapism to the past. The other is actually one of the only ways for the past to speak with the present. It's a very critical book, although the criticism does not come from hate. Israel of 2019 is a hating state. Everybody hates everybody. And identity...
Not in this studio. I just want our listeners to know.
And identity is shaped by victimhood. Everybody did something to somebody. This is not the way to shape a national identity. A national identity should be shaped by something that you strive for. Now, my criticism, and I say it in the introduction, is if you read the conclusion of the book, is a very strong criticism, but it comes out of love. By the way, some of Israel's most crucial critics, Gideon Levy and others, are the biggest lovers of Israel. Their criticism comes from deep love and connection to this place. I am out of this country. I'm like a fish out of water. Yet, I see. And I see what I see. And our generation, in a way, was a very successful generation. We are having a very good life. Most of us have very successful children. You can see the high-tech, etc. In a way, we are too comfortable. But whenever I go to a demonstration, let me tell you, I don't see the young people. I only see my generation.
Maybe they're the ones who are too comfortable.
No, because they're all abroad. I mean, it's interesting what you said about the second generation and the migration out of Israel, the Yerida, so to speak, is that, maybe they were instilled this, a search for normalcy, but instead of trying to achieve it at home, they just went and looked for it somewhere else.
Because, in a way, today, my generation is just one more section in Israeli society. They are not the majority. As you know, because we are speaking a week after the 2019 elections. Now, let me tell you also that the Prime Minister, Netanyahu, is also somebody from the generation.
Was born in Israel in 1949.
Yes.
Do you think he would agree with your characterization or of the experience and the mood you try to portray of how children grew up at that time?
Let me tell you, although he was born in Israel, 1949, that makes him part of this generation, he didn't grow up here. His family were Yordim.
Part of his life. I mean, his early years were
in adolescence. This is one of your most formative years. He internalized very much the military experience, and he came back in 1973, and then back to America. But his formative years were not here. Basically, I mentioned him because he's, in a way, a mirror by which to judge most of this generation. Most of us stayed here. The question is our children. Now, was it Israel that changed? Was it the fact that our children do not know how to describe the shape of the country? They have a country that does not have physical borders. They cannot draw the country like I did. Like every one of my generation knows to shape it. And I'm making movements with my hand.
No, you are. And I have to tell you that when I saw that map in the book, I thought, gee, that's the first time in a long time that I've seen a map of Israel without Greater Israel.
Yeah.
Our children does not know to draw it. And also, we lost our national borders because Netanyahu defines himself as the prime minister of the Jewish people. Now, basically, in a normal state, the prime minister is the prime minister of the citizens of that state. The whole term of citizenship, the whole term of who are we vis-a-vis the diaspora, has, in a way, evaporated. So our children grow with a very undefined national identity, which the price is, of course, the fact that they are not attached here in the same way that my generation.
Hanna, let me ask you one last question because we're running out of time. You use the personal pronoun a lot. We, my generation, our children, etc. Did you ever think of, initially when you started working on this book, did you think of just writing it as an autobiography and then Hanna Yablonka, the individual, was interfered by Hanna Yablonka, the historian? And no, you never thought about writing an autobiography?
But in the process of writing, and the writing, out of the 9 years that it took me to write this book, 2 years was the writing process. Once I sat down to write the book, which was 2 years every day from 7:30 in the morning to 2:00 at night, sometimes only coming with one sentence.
Every writer knows that experience.
Yeah, I guess so.
Can we not talk about this after the election? Too traumatic.
In some instances, I put myself... Now, when I speak our generation, and let me tell you, I met until now, it's 5 months, I guess I met more than 25,000 people of my generation in huge events and small events. Small meaning 60, 70 events, and I speak to them. And the thirst that they express, the fact that they suddenly discovered that they are a generation and not individuals, dispersed individuals, is so intense that sometimes I am carried out in my tongue and I'm speaking about us. But it isn't us. And everyone in this generation speaks about us because people wrote me, and I get every day 10 to 15 letters. I never knew you before. I knew some of your Eichmann books and that, but I never knew you before. You were not in my classroom. How did you describe my classroom? I mean, it was such a homogeneous Israeli. Also, I have to say the Oriental Jews as well. I grew up in Beersheba. And in Beersheba, half of my class were people whose parents came from North Africa, etc. We are speaking, and our childhood was so homogeneous, so resembled each other's that it's an us. And sometimes I speak in us, especially when the interview is intimate and I feel comfortable.
Great.
Okay,
So
we had an us once.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll have it again one day. Professor Hanna Yablonka, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you.
And thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and Itai Shelem and Georgia Foscarini, our producers, and to the Van Leer Institute and the Israel Institute for their generous support. Now a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we want to ask you to please consider writing a review. We just read them all, and we loved it, so please write them.
Yeah, if you want to make us happy, please write a review.
Including critical. We take all opinions. You too can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive with over 500 interviews. If you like us, you can also like us on Facebook. We're called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. Follow both me and Gilad on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.